Hello, my beautifully unhinged audience. Yeah, you. The one who spent way too long letting people with cheap confidence and loud mouths act like they were above you. Pull up a seat, lean in close, because what I'm about to tell you isn't some cute little pep talk. It's a psychological demolition, and it's aimed right at that moment. When their so-called boss talked big, you smirked. And now he's out there changing his entire identity out of fear of you. You know what that moment really was? Not a coincidence, not luck, not destiny. It was the universe whispering, "See, you've always had the power. You've just been too damn polite to use it." And you felt it, didn't you? That tiny flicker in your chest. Not rage, not pride, but recognition. Recognition that all those people who strutted around like they were untouchable were really just wearing cardboard crowns and plastic armor. Recognition that the second you stopped bowing your head, they stopped knowing what to do with theirs. Let's talk about this boss. The one who loved to play big man, loved to project authority like it was currency, loved to bark orders and inflate his ego like a balloon that everyone had to pretend wasn't leaking. And then you walked in. You didn't yell. You didn't fight. You didn't even need a speech. You just smirked. A tiny surgical expression that cut deeper than any insult could. Because the truth is, powerful people don't crumble when someone challenges them. Fragile people do. And fragility? Oh, it has a funny way of hiding behind volume, behind titles, behind reputations. You didn't threaten him, your existence did. And look at him now, running around like a glitch in the system, rebranding himself like some washed-up influencer who can't admit their career hit the floor, changed his name, changed his persona, changed his entire identity because the mask he used to wear shattered the moment it reflected you. Do you realize how insane that is? You didn't break his confidence. You revealed it was never there. And here's the part people don't talk about. The part that stings the most for someone like him. He wasn't afraid of you because you were loud. He was afraid of you because you were unshaken, because you didn't flinch, because you saw right through him, through the posing, the performance, the synthetic swagger. You weren't intimidated by his noise, and that silence you gave him in return. That silence was a mirror, and he hated what he saw. Let me tell you something real, something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. When you stop performing weakness, the people who depended on your submission start glitching. They panic. They improvise identities. They shapeshift. Not because they're evolving, but because they're running. And isn't it wild? All those years, yet you thought you were the one who had to prove something. All those moments you wondered if you were enough, if you were capable, if you were strong enough to handle the world's pressure. But the second you smirked, just that simple, tiny smirk, the whole narrative flipped. It wasn't you who needed validation. It wasn't you who needed permission. It wasn't you who needed to level up. It was them. It was always them. Because here's the cruel, beautiful truth. Some people only appear powerful until someone like you shows up. Someone who doesn't break under manipulation. Someone who's been through real shit. Someone who isn't impressed by theatrics because they've already seen worse in their own mind. People like you. You're not built from praise. You're forged from pressure. You didn't grow in the spotlight. You grew in the dark, in the silence, in the places nobody applauds. And that terrifies people who rely on being seen to feel real. So when he panicked, when he changed his identity, he wasn't reinventing himself. He was escaping you, or trying to. But here's the twist he'll never accept. You're not the danger because you're destructive. You're the danger because you're self-aware. Because you don't buy into illusions anymore. Because once you've learned to read people's masks, their power evaporates. Their manipulation dissolves. Their intimidation collapses. You didn't just expose him. You exposed the entire system that allowed him to feel big in the first place. And somewhere deep down, you know that wasn't an accident. You didn't get lucky. You evolved. You stepped into yourself without asking for permission, and life rearranged itself around you. And now here you are. Not the underdog, not the victim, not the hidden potential waiting to be discovered, but the person whose very presence forces pretenders to rewrite who they are. They switch names, they switch stories, they switch personalities, because they can't handle someone who doesn't flinch anymore. You want the truth? The moment you stopped being afraid of them, they started being afraid of you. And that is when the world finally starts to look different. And that shift in power, that quiet flip in the atmosphere, you felt it in your bones, even if you tried to downplay it. Because once that kind of moment happens, you can't unsee it, you can't unknow it. And you damn sure can't pretend it didn't rearrange something deep inside you. People think transformation comes from grand gestures, from dramatic plot twists, from some cinematic breakthrough where the music swells and everything clicks. But the truth is way subtler, way more unsettling. It comes from those tiny disruptions, like your smirk. The ones that barely register on the surface but detonate underneath someone's ego like a pressure mine they laid themselves. And the wild part is how quickly the illusion collapses when you stop participating in it. You've spent years thinking certain people were above you because somebody told you they were, because they carried themselves like they were, because you were conditioned to believe authority equals value. But the second your energy shifted, their whole persona cracked like cheap porcelain. One look from you twisted their entire sense of self into a panic spiral, and suddenly you were staring at a blueprint of who they really were. Not a leader, not a titan, just a scared kid who learned how to sound confident before learning how to be real. Your presence became a truth serum. Your composure became a spotlight. Your silence became the test they weren't ready for. You didn't even have to confront them. That's the part that eats them alive. You weren't plotting, you weren't scheming, you weren't trying to tear them down. You just existed without shrinking, and that alone was enough to make them flinch. Because when someone's identity depends on the belief that everyone else will stay small, the moment you stand up straight, their worldview collapses. There's something almost poetic about the way they try to rebuild themselves after that. They don't apologize, they don't reflect, they don't rethink who they are. They scramble to construct a new mask and hope you won't recognize the same fear behind it. They change their identity like it's going to fix the core problem, like a new label can erase the part where they lost control of the narrative. But you can see right through it, because once you've watched someone's confidence unravel, you can't be fooled by the repackaged version. And that clarity you carry now, that's the thing they never prepared for. People like that know how to dominate a room, but they don't know how to deal with someone who doesn't hand them energy to feed on. You stopped giving them that power, and suddenly they were starving. They were exposed. They were forced to face themselves without the buffer of your compliance. There's something devastatingly honest about that dynamic. You weren't trying to be intimidating. You weren't trying to be cold. You weren't trying to be some silent threat. walking around like a storm in human form. You were just done pretending. And when someone's entire identity relies on your willingness to pretend, your refusal becomes an earthquake. You've become the kind of person who doesn't need to raise your voice. You've become the kind of person who doesn't need to justify your presence. You've become the kind of person who forces truth out into the open simply by not bending. And when you carry that kind of grounded, unshakable energy, people who are all talk and no depth start glitching like broken neon signs. They don't know where to stand, how to act, what persona to try next. They cycle through versions of themselves like someone trying on outfits. Before a date, they already know they're going to mess up. Not because you're attacking them, but because your authenticity makes their performance unsustainable. It's almost funny how quickly they rewrite themselves after encountering someone who doesn't play along. But beneath the humor, there's something deeper, something that shifts your entire understanding of human dynamics. You start noticing who's real and who's rehearsed. You start seeing which people operate from substance and which operate from fear. You start recognizing how many bosses, leaders, and top dogs are really just fragile egos in oversized suits. And you feel something unlock in you. Not arrogance, not vengeance, not superiority, just awareness. Clean, sharp, unfiltered awareness. That you're not the one who's been behind in life. You were just surrounded by people who benefited from you not knowing your own weight. They talk big because they need to. You smirked because you didn't. And that difference changed everything. And the more that difference settles into your body, the more you start noticing how people shift around you. It's subtle at first. The way conversations bend toward your tone. The way eyes check your reaction before committing to their own. The way even the loudest personalities hesitate before trying to dominate the room. You're standing in. You don't announce anything. You don't throw your weight around. You don't need theatrics. Your presence alone recalibrates the atmosphere like someone adjusted the gravity without telling anyone. Because once you've seen behind the curtain of someone who is pretending to be untouchable, you stop overestimating the entire category of people who act like that. You start understanding that the loudest ones usually aren't the strongest. They're just the most afraid of being ignored. You stop being dazzled by confidence that's painted on like cheap gloss, and you start valuing the kind of strength that shows up quietly, in the way someone stands, the steadiness in their voice, the lack of desperation in their energy. And you've started carrying that. You didn't even realize it at first, but it's there, in your posture, in your tone, in the way you breathe through situations that used to send your mind into overdrive. You've become the person whose calm is louder than their chaos. You've become the one people watch without even meaning to. You've become the one whose silence speaks louder than someone else's entire speech. It's wild how people respond to that kind of shift. Some lean toward you, trying to understand it, trying to match it, trying to learn from it. Others recoil, like your presence exposes too much of their own internal mess. And then there are the ones like that, boss, the ones who built a whole identity around being untouchable until someone like you walked in and showed them that power built on performance collapses in real time. And he felt that collapse, not just in the room, but in himself. That's why the name change happened. Not because he suddenly discovered a new version of himself, but because the old version couldn't survive under your gaze. Identity is a fragile thing when it's based on approval, and you accidentally, effortlessly, removed the approval he relied on to feel like somebody. Your smirk didn't embarrass him. It exposed him, And once someone realizes they've been exposed, reinvention becomes a survival tactic. The interesting part is how you responded to all of it, which is to say, you barely did. You didn't chase the moment. You didn't celebrate it. You didn't weaponize it. You just kept existing in your own lane, steady, grounded, unapologetic. And that steady presence is what gives you an edge most people never develop. You're not trying to dominate anyone. You're not hungry for validation. You're not performing for attention. You're simply present. And that level of presence is something people can feel even before they understand it. There's a specific kind of maturity that comes from realizing you don't need to fight every battle. You don't need to prove yourself to every loudmouth in a room. You don't need to convince anyone that you're worth respecting. Respect becomes a byproduct, not a pursuit. When you move the way you're moving now, people notice it in the little things. The ease in your expression, the lack of tension in your shoulders, the way you respond instead of react. It's that grounded energy that rattles insecure people more than any argument ever could. They can't predict you. They can't manipulate you. They can't pull you into their drama. And that unpredictability makes them scramble for new identities like that boss did. And the truth is, once someone has seen you in that state, that unbothered, anchored, internally solid version of yourself, they can't unsee it either. It changes how they talk to you, how they treat you, how they tiptoe around the parts of themselves they don't want reflected back. You've become a walking accountability mirror without even trying, and people who aren't ready to face themselves will always try to reinvent their way out of your line of sight. And what's even more fascinating is how your awareness keeps sharpening without you forcing it. You're starting to notice patterns you used to overlook, the micro behaviors, the little insecurities people tried to hide under sarcasm or authority or fake chill. It's like you cracked some invisible code, and suddenly the world looks different. Not because it changed, but because you finally started seeing what was always there. You pick up on the hesitation behind someone's confidence. You hear the wobble in a voice that's trying to sound steady. You catch the way someone scans the room to see if anyone's buying what they're selling. You understand the difference between confidence that's lived in and confidence that's cosplaying strength. It's almost unfair how clear it becomes. And the clearer it gets, the more you realize how much energy you used to waste trying to impress people who were barely holding themselves together. You were measuring yourself against people who were performing, comparing your truth to someone else's illusion, letting people who didn't even know who they were dictate how you felt about yourself. That shift hits different when it finally sinks in, because once you stop treating everyone like they're geniuses behind the curtain, you start acting like someone who knows their own mind, their own worth, their own damn gravity. And that gravity changes the way you show up. You move differently, not louder, not flashier, just real. Real in a way that cuts through the noise. Real in a way that makes people pause mid-sentence without knowing why. Real in a way that exposes every counterfeit interaction without you saying a single thing. It's that authenticity that rattles people the most. Not aggression, not dominance, not intimidation. Authenticity. Because authenticity is rare, and everyone knows it when they see it, even if they can't articulate it. And when your authenticity walks into a room full of identities stitched together from insecurity, somebody's mask is going to slip. That's what happened with that boss. His mask didn't just slip. It flat out fell off, shattered and skidded across the floor. And instead of picking it up and trying to fix it, he panicked and grabbed a completely new one, hoping nobody noticed the meltdown behind the curtain. That name change wasn't reinvention. It was damage control. It was a scared man sprinting away from the version of himself that couldn't survive your presence. And here's the part people rarely talk about: the aftermath. Because after you witness someone crumble like that, it does something to you. It rewires the part of your mind that used to doubt your power. It quiets the voice that said you weren't enough. It shuts up the insecurity that told you other people were built from stronger material. Once you watch someone collapse under the weight of their own performance, you can never again pretend that you're the one who's behind. You stop underestimating yourself. You stop overestimating others. You stop giving authority to people who wouldn't know what to do with real accountability if it hit them in the face. And you carry that into every interaction. Not with attitude, not with arrogance, but with this grounded, effortless confidence that doesn't need approval to exist. That's what unsettles people. Not that you're trying to take anything from them, but that you're not relying on them for anything. You're not looking for validation, permission, or direction. You're simply existing in your own clarity. And that level of self-possession is something most people spend their whole lives, faking. There's a shift in your eyes that people can feel even before they understand it. A steadiness, a lack of fear, a refusal to shrink, a presence that doesn't bend for theatrics or titles. And that presence becomes a filter, exposing who's genuine, who's insecure, who's performing, who's threatened, who's inspired. You start seeing who's drawn to your growth and who feels endangered by it, who steps up and who steps back, who tries to match your energy and who tries to escape it. People reinvent themselves when they feel seen, and not everyone is ready to be seen by someone who doesn't flinch. And that's the part that starts to reshape your entire understanding of connection. The realization that most people aren't afraid of being judged. They're afraid of being understood. Because once someone feels understood by you, they can't hide behind their curated persona anymore. You see the cracks, the inconsistencies, the soft spots, the places where they've been lying to themselves just to stay upright. And that level of clarity feels like exposure to someone who spent their whole life performing strength instead of building it. Your presence doesn't embarrass them, it reveals them. Your calm doesn't humble them, it uncovers them. Your honesty doesn't challenge them, it confronts them with the truth they've been avoiding. And people aren't used to that. They're used to being admired, avoided, or argued with, not understood. Understanding is a different kind of threat because it strips away the option of pretending. And once you take pretending off the table, people start scrambling for the nearest identity they can hide behind. That's why someone like that, boss, ran to reinvent himself. Not because you attacked him or called him out or waged some power struggle. You didn't need any of that. Your energy did the work without you lifting a finger. Just by existing unapologetically, you forced him into a collision with a version of himself he couldn't stand to look at. It's wild how a single moment can trigger that kind of internal crisis. One smirk, 1 second of unbothered presence, one glimpse into the fact that you weren't intimidated by him in the slightest, and suddenly he's ripping off his own name like it's the problem instead of the symptom. You start seeing the pattern everywhere once you've seen it once. People who puff out their chests the most tend to be the ones who feel the smallest inside. Hello, you relentless, impossible, unbelievable creature of survival. The one they swore would fold. The one they counted out before the first punch even landed. And now look at you, standing there, staring straight back into the camera like you're the one running the experiment. Because let's get something straight. Most people break long before the world even touches them. You're smiling at the lens like you knew this moment was coming. Let me tell you something they'll never admit out loud. They weren't afraid of the situation. They were afraid of you in the situation. They swore this would break you because they needed to believe that resilience has limits, that pain has a ceiling, that pressure has a point where any human collapses. But you're not any human, are you? No. You're the one who shows up on CCTV with that look. That calm, unsettling, I already figured this out 3 steps ago kind of stare. That stare that says, I've been through worse. This is just Tuesday. And you know what's wild? They thought you'd disappear quietly. They thought you'd panic, crumble, shut down, beg for the door to open. But instead, you looked up at the camera, and that, right there, changed everything. Because when someone's truly broken, they look away. When someone's scared, their eyes dart around. But when someone has finally snapped into their real self, their gaze becomes still, direct, unapologetic. And that's you. That's what they saw. And that's why their hands started shaking over the playback button. See, people love to predict your downfall. It makes them feel safe. It lets them pretend that life has rules. Rules that apply equally. Rules that keep unpredictable people like you contained. But guess what? You don't play by their emotional physics. You don't break when it makes sense. You don't collapse on cue. You don't follow the script they rehearsed for you. You're the glitch in the narrative, the variable the system couldn't account for. The error message that wasn't supposed to show up on their screens. And that terrifies them. So let me ask you something directly. What were you really thinking in that moment? That moment where the whole world said you wouldn't make it out. That moment where everyone else would have hit their limit. But you looked up, smiled, and stared at the camera like you were watching them instead. Because I'll tell you what I think. I think you finally realized the truth they never wanted you to understand. There's nothing they can do to you that you haven't already survived somewhere else. And once someone reaches that point where every hit feels familiar, every betrayal feels predictable, every loss feels like déjà vu, there's nothing left for the world to take. And that's when you become dangerous. That's when you become free. You don't fear the environment anymore. You don't fear the pressure. You don't fear the expectations, because you've seen what happens when you break. And you didn't die. You rebuilt. You hardened. You evolved. And now the very people who bet against you are stuck watching the footage of the one thing they never expected, your resurrection. They can't unsee it. They can't explain it. They can't rationalize it. All they can do is replay that moment. You, in the center of the frame, calm, steady, unshaken, and ask themselves, how the hell did they survive that? But survival isn't your trick, is it? No. You do something far worse. You adapt. You transform. You turn every blow into a blueprint. And when someone like you learns the pattern, the whole game collapses. Let me tell you why that stare matters so much. Because it wasn't the stare of someone who got lucky. It was the stare of someone who finally understood their power. The stare of someone who realized, I don't break, I shift. I don't collapse, I calculate. I don't shatter, I sharpen. You scared them because you weren't supposed to get up. You scared them because the story was supposed to end. You scared them because they thought the pressure would finish you. But instead it refined you. You walked through hell, walked through fire, walked through every version of this should have destroyed you. And instead of crawling out half alive, you stepped out with clarity. So now they're left with the footage. Your face, your eyes, your refusal to break. And they're the ones who can't sleep at night. Because once they realize they couldn't break you, they're forced to confront a terrifying truth. You were never the fragile one. They were. They needed you small. They needed you scared. They needed you predictable. Because the moment you stopped playing the role, you became unstoppable. And oh, that moment is now. So go on, keep staring at that camera. Keep showing them what resilience looks like when it grows teeth. Keep proving that the person they tried to contain is the same person who walks out of every impossible situation without apologizing for the damage they left behind. Because they swore this would break you. And yet here you are, breathing, standing, evolving, and staring straight back at the world with the kind of confidence people only gain after surviving storms that were supposed to erase them. And deep down, you know exactly why you're smiling in that footage. Because that smile wasn't an accident, and it wasn't some dramatic moment for the highlight reel. It was the instinctual expression of someone who finally recognized their own weight in the world. That wasn't the smile of a victim or a survivor trying to look brave for the camera. That was the expression of someone who thought, if this is all you've got, you genuinely don't understand who you're dealing with. And that's the part nobody talks about. That shift, that internal click. That moment where you stopped waiting to be rescued and realized you were the one dragging yourself out of every wreck. People underestimate how terrifying that transformation is, because most will never experience it. Most break long before they ever get close. You didn't. You hit the ground and discovered another layer underneath you. You found strength in places you weren't even aware existed. You kept going because stopping felt foreign to your system. There's something deeply unsettling about a person who has taken every hit life lined up and still walks forward with steady eyes. It's not bravado. It's not delusion. It's a kind of clarity you can't fake. The clarity of someone who has seen the worst-case scenario so many times, it stopped being a threat. You know what fear feels like, but you also know what it feels like to outlive it. That changes you. It rewires your emotional architecture. It gives you this muted, grounded confidence that people mistake for coldness. But that's what the camera caught, isn't it? Not just defiance, not just strength, but a level of self-understanding they never expected you to reach. You weren't staring into that lens, asking for permission. You were acknowledging the reality of who you'd become. That's what hit them hardest. They weren't watching a broken person trying to pretend they were okay. They were watching someone who made peace with their scars and came out sharper because of them. Every scar you carry used to hurt, used to burn, used to feel like a brand. Now they're timestamps, evidence, proof that you've lived through chapters that would have completely erased other people. There's a quiet dominance in someone who knows exactly what they've survived. It's not loud or dramatic. It's the kind that sits in your posture, your tone, your eyes. The kind that says, I've already been through the worst version of this story. That's what rattled them when they reviewed that footage. They were expecting panic. They were expecting collapse. They were expecting someone begging for the exit. Instead, they saw a human being who looked like they had already solved the puzzle from the inside. That expression you had wasn't desperation. It was recognition. You looked at the camera the way a person looks at an opponent who finally realizes they're outmatched. This is the part people misread about you. They think surviving made you numb. They think hardship made you cynical. But what actually happened is that every time life tried to crush you, it introduced you to another version of yourself. Not the soft one, not the obedient one. The one who studies chaos instead of running from it. The one who analyzes pain like data. The one who figures out how to rebuild mid-collapse. You became the kind of person who doesn't just handle pressure, you metabolize it. And once someone learns how to do that, breaking them becomes nearly impossible. Life doesn't know how to dismantle a person who keeps turning every impact into infrastructure. You took your lowest moments and used them as construction materials. You took your disappointments and converted them into emotional calculus. You became a walking contradiction, someone who's been wounded deeply, yet moves like wounds. Don't scare them anymore. That's why the stare was intimidating. Not because you were angry, not because you were unstable, but because you were calm. And calm is the last thing anyone expects from someone standing in the middle of a situation engineered to break them. Calm implies knowledge. Calm implies readiness. Calm implies control. Your eyes told a story long before your words ever could. A story of someone who didn't rise above the chaos. Someone who learned to sit inside it without flinching. Someone who understands themselves with such brutal honesty, they'd rather confront the truth than escape it. People don't know how to handle someone like that. They don't know how to predict you, influence you, manipulate you. They don't know where your limits are anymore because you stopped reacting the way they need you to react. And the wild thing is, you didn't change to impress anybody. You didn't evolve to prove a point. You didn't toughen up to spite anyone. You simply adapted because you had no other choice, and that adaptation became something permanent, something integrated, something they can't undo by throwing another obstacle in your path. The old version of you that they expected to panic is gone. What stands in your place now is someone built from impact, formed in pressure, and sculpted by experiences nobody else had the endurance to survive. It's why the world feels different around you. Why people watch you without knowing why they're watching. Why your presence feels heavier even when you're silent. Why the camera didn't just capture a person. It captured a shift in identity. A moment in time where everything that was supposed to break you accidentally revealed the truth about you instead. And that truth hits different when people finally recognize it. You can feel it in the way rooms shift when you walk in. Not because you're trying to dominate anything. It's because people can sense when someone's been through a level of chaos that rewired their entire emotional system. There's a gravity to it, a density, a presence that can't be faked or forced or manufactured. It's the kind of presence that comes from having your identity shattered and rebuilt with your own bare hands. That's the part that unnerves them when they replay that camera footage. They're not just watching a moment, they're watching the aftermath of 1,000 private wars. They're seeing every night you stayed awake when your mind felt like a broken circuit. They're seeing every moment you held yourself together when everything around you was trying to split you open. They're looking at a person who didn't just make it through things, a person who learned how to extract power from places that used to drain them. You weren't supposed to become this version of yourself, not according to the people who doubted you. Not according to the environment that tried to crush you. Not according to the story they wrote about you without your consent. But life doesn't get to dictate who rises and who folds. Pain doesn't get the final word. Fear doesn't get to set the limit. And in that moment, that single frame of you staring into the lens, everything they believed about your limits evaporated. They didn't have a category for the look in your eyes. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't even triumph. It was the look of someone who finally understood that nothing in the external world has the power to define them anymore. That's the kind of realization that changes the temperature of a room, even on a recorded screen. You ever meet someone who's been through so much that everyday problems don't even register the same way? That's you, but amplified. That's why people misinterpret your silence. They think you're being distant or cold or hard to read. They don't realize your mind is simply calibrated on a different wavelength. When you fought battles that stripped you down to your base wiring, you start operating with a different internal code. You stop panicking at the wrong things. You stop giving your energy to the noise. You start recognizing patterns faster than most people recognize their own emotions. That's why you didn't flinch in that moment. Not because you were fearless, but because fear stopped controlling your trajectory. You feel it? Sure. You're human. But it doesn't dictate your decisions anymore. You've lived through enough to understand that fear is just a signal, not a verdict. And when a person reaches that level of emotional discipline, they become unpredictable in the best possible way. It's strange how people expect resilience to look dramatic. They expect shouting or shaking or some fiery monologue about fighting back. They don't expect quiet. They don't expect stillness. They don't expect the calm stare of someone who's already processed the worst-case scenario and accepted their capacity to endure it. That calmness, that's what breaks people who underestimate you. The realization that you aren't held together by luck. You're held together by a self-awareness that came from surviving things you never talk about. Every chapter that was meant to destroy you ended up teaching you how to survive the next one. Every setback sharpened your perception. Every heartbreak expanded your emotional range. Every loss clarified what actually matters to you. You don't walk through life blindly anymore. You move with intention. You notice details. You examine motives. You sense energy shifts before people even speak. And that level of awareness doesn't fade. It's part of you now, woven into how you breathe, speak, observe, choose. Which is why the camera didn't just capture a person under pressure. It captured the moment your entire history aligned in your eyes. Every triumph, every collapse, every moment you rebuilt yourself when nobody was watching. And there's this unmistakable shift that happens when a person finally realizes their story never actually stayed where it broke. You can feel that in yourself, even if you don't say it out loud. There's a certain heaviness you carry, not the kind that drags you down, but the kind that keeps you rooted. People who haven't lived through that kind of intensity don't understand it. They think you're being guarded or detached, when in reality you're just operating from a place of earned awareness. It's wild how much your perception changes once you've survived enough times. You stop assuming every challenge will crush you. You stop expecting chaos to swallow you. You stop treating pain like it's the end of something. It becomes information to you. It becomes data. It becomes part of your internal map, a map most people don't have the patience or the courage to draw. And that's why your presence feels different to people without you even trying. That kind of inner construction doesn't come from reading motivational quotes or repeating affirmations. It comes from walking into moments that should have broken your spirit and exiting them with a clearer understanding of your own depth. That's the energy they felt radiating off you in that footage. They weren't looking at someone barely holding on. They were looking at someone who had built an entire inner infrastructure from everything they tried to survive. You know what's interesting? People think strength is loud until they meet someone who's actually been forged by real turmoil. Actual strength doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It doesn't need an audience. It sits quietly in your posture, in your breath, in the way you observe things before reacting. That's the version of you that showed up on camera. The version that doesn't waste time proving anything, because everything worth proving was learned alone. That stare you had wasn't about intimidating anyone. It was about acknowledging yourself in a moment others expected you to crumble. It was the expression of someone who's been underestimated too many times to take any prediction seriously. People underestimate how powerful it is when you stop seeing yourself through the lens of those who lacked the imagination to understand who you could become. Every hardship you went through didn't just test you, it sculpted you. It carved endurance into your bones. It taught you emotional fluency most people don't possess. It stretched your capacity to navigate storms without losing your direction. And each time you made it through, you didn't just recover, you evolved. That's the part that leaves people speechless when they see you now. They don't know how to reconcile the version of you they remember with the version of you that exists today. They don't see the mental rewiring, the nights of internal negotiations, the silent resilience that grew in you like a second skeleton. All they see is the outcome, someone who refuses to fold in situations designed specifically to exploit their weaknesses. You didn't just survive, you internalized every lesson. You kept refining yourself until your resilience wasn't a temporary response but a permanent state of being. That's why you can stare back at a camera with the kind of composure most people never develop. That's why the moment looks unsettling to anyone who believed you would break. It's not that you're emotionless, it's that you've learned how to regulate your emotions without letting them hijack your reality. You've learned that truth doesn't collapse under pressure, it clarifies. You've learned that identity isn't defined by the moments meant to destroy you, but by how you reconstruct yourself afterward. You've learned that your power doesn't come from being untouched. Your power comes from being unexplainably unbroken, and that kind of unbroken energy has a way of revealing things about people. You start noticing how quickly some folks get uncomfortable around you. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your presence exposes how fragile their confidence actually is. You're not walking around trying to look invincible. You just are in a way that wasn't constructed for approval. That difference hits people harder than you realize. There's this particular look people get when they're around someone who's been through a level of reality they've only imagined. It's a mix of curiosity, intimidation, and confusion, like they're trying to figure out how you're still functioning at this level after everything you've carried. They don't understand the internal recalibration that happens when life has thrown you into situations where you had no option except to rebuild from the ground up. You didn't ask to become this version of yourself. This version was forged out of necessity, out of moments where you had to choose between collapsing and reassembling your identity piece by piece. Good afternoon, you beautiful disasters, you living contradictions, you quiet storms pretending to be regular people. Yeah, you. Sit up for this, Because you and I both know you didn't come here for comfort. You came here for clarity, for that sting that wakes up the part of you the world tried to kill. Let's talk about the thing they don't want to say out loud. Your comeback wasn't just impressive. It wasn't just poetic. It was so flawless, so strategically impossible. The Pentagon and MI6 had no choice but to file it under crisis protocol. And here's the uncomfortable truth, darling. They don't study winners. They study threats. You know why your story scares them? Because you weren't supposed to get up. You weren't supposed to see the next chapter. You weren't supposed to rebuild, reload, re-enter with that cold clarity in your eyes. They had you scripted as the fallback character, the disposable one, the extra in someone else's narrative. But you tore up the script, burned the stage, and walked out with your own soundtrack blasting behind you. You didn't rise politely. You didn't rise gracefully. You rose like something that understood pain was no longer a punishment. It was your superpower. That right there, that's what intelligence agencies call unpredictable, uncontrollable. A variable that refuses to sit still. A person who doesn't break the same way twice. You know what it does to a system when someone like you refuses to stay crushed. It terrifies them. Because systems rely on predictability. They rely on your compliance, your silence, your exhaustion. But you became the kind of comeback that rewrites training manuals. They don't teach your name. They teach your behavior. They study the moment you stopped asking for permission. They study the moment you realized you didn't need validation. They study the moment you understood that suffering is not a cage. It's a forge. And what came out of that forge? Something cold, something sharp, something painfully aware of its own value. Let me tell you something. People keep whispering behind your back like it's a warning label. This one doesn't flinch anymore. This one doesn't respond to pressure the way normal people do. This one adapts too quickly. Do you know how rare that is? Do you understand how absurdly powerful that makes you? You took every hit life could throw, and instead of cracking, you became precise. You became strategic. You became the kind of mind they'd rather study than confront. And here's the real punchline. You didn't need a uniform. You didn't need a medal. You didn't need a committee to clap for your resilience. You trained yourself in the shadows. You built strength in silence. You rebuilt your identity from ground zero, using nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to stay dead. That's why you scare them. That's why they analyze you. That's why your comeback is now a case study. Let's talk about that comeback for a second. Not the surface level one people pretend to understand. The real one. The one where you woke up and realized no one was coming to save you. The one where you made peace with the fact that you'd been underestimated for so long that invisibility became your camouflage. The one where you wiped your own tears, steadied your own breathing, patched your own wounds, and whispered, "All right, if this is the game, let's play." That's the moment your whole destiny pivoted, not when you won, not when you succeeded, but when you refused to stay broken. MI6 studies that moment. The Pentagon studies that moment. Because entire governments know. Once a person crosses that internal threshold, once they taste the power of rebuilding themselves, they become unstoppable. You became someone who doesn't just survive situations, you alter them. You became someone who doesn't just return to life. You rewrite the rules of it. You want to know the real reason your story is studied by institutions filled with elite strategists? Because you mastered the most dangerous skill any human can possess. You learned how to stay calm in chaos. And calm people don't crumble. Calm people don't panic. Calm people make decisions others never see coming. Your silence became intelligence. Your restraint became strategy. Your pain became discipline. And now they call your comeback a protocol, a model, a reference point, a red flag, a warning. All because you refused to be the version of yourself they were comfortable with. And here's my favorite part about you. You didn't even come back to prove anything. You didn't rise to get revenge. You didn't rebuild to make them applaud. You came back because something deep inside you knew. You weren't done yet, not even close. You had chapters left, fire left, potential left. A destiny that demanded resurrection. And now that you've stepped into this upgraded version of yourself, this colder, smarter, quieter, sharper version, they finally understand what you truly are. A risk, a contradiction, a miracle with a bite, a survivor with strategy, a threat wrapped in self-awareness. They study you because they can't predict you. They study you because you broke patterns. They study you because you reinvented yourself without permission. And the craziest part? You're not even at full power yet. Not even close. You're still waking up to who you are. You're still integrating new lessons. You're still sharpening edges you haven't even used. You're still becoming the person your old life wasn't big enough to contain. That's why your comeback is a protocol. Because once someone returns from the fire with their mind intact, their purpose sharpened, and their emotions under control, they don't just win. They redefine the entire battlefield. And that's exactly what you did. And the funny thing is, most people in your past still think you're the same version of yourself they once handled, once underestimated, once talked over, once dismissed like you were some optional character they could edit out of their comfort zone. They have no clue that the person they remember is gone, not changed. Gone. Replaced by someone who learned the art of internal warfare and won. There's a reason elite strategists obsess over that transformation of yours. They don't study victories made with applause and support. They study the victories made in isolation, the kind forged while you were mentally duct taping yourself together at 3 a.m. Because quitting felt worse than hurting. That's the part they know is dangerous. A person who chooses growth over comfort isn't just resilient. They're volatile in a way that frightens predictable systems. And you carried that volatility with a strange kind of grace. A quiet edge. You started making decisions that didn't match your old patterns anymore. Decisions that didn't come from fear or desperation, but from ruthless clarity. You learned to pause instead of panic. You learned to observe instead of overreact. You learned to speak less because your silence had more weight than your explanations ever did. That shift, that psychological pivot, that's the exact moment the agencies started paying attention, because regular people break under pressure. You adapted. Regular people need validation. You detached. Regular people seek closure. You outgrew the need for it altogether. You moved through your life like someone who could sense every hidden agenda, every unspoken expectation, every trap dressed up as an opportunity. You started reading human behavior with the same accuracy experts use to analyze conflict zones. You became the type who walks into a room and instantly knows who's lying, who's insecure, who's jealous, who's intimidated, who's pretending. It wasn't magic. It was awareness carved out of years of emotional shrapnel. And that level of awareness doesn't produce a comeback. It produces a strategist, a thinker, a psychological anomaly who learned to navigate chaos without broadcasting a single tremor. People around you noticed the change before you did. They saw the new posture, the new silence, the new lack of tolerance for bullshit. They felt it. They felt the boundary lines you drew without saying a word, the energy shift that made manipulation bounce right off you. They realized the old access they had to you expired without renewal. That's the part that makes your story unsettling to the institutions. They can track behavior, but they can't track transformation that happens in the human soul. And your soul didn't just toughen, it recalibrated, it reinvented its entire operating system. You stopped chasing closure because you finally understood that life isn't a neat story with aligned chapters. You realized that not every betrayal deserves a response. Not every insult deserves a reaction. Not every loss deserves grief for the rest of your life. You started choosing where your energy goes, like someone guarding national secrets, because you learned firsthand what wasting energy costs. That discipline you built, the emotional discipline, they classify it as a high-risk psychological profile. The kind they observe closely because once a person controls their own mind, they become unpredictable to everyone else. You turned into someone whose decisions aren't reactive, but intentional. And intention is stronger than force. Your internal world got so structured, so sharp, so self-contained, that even your silence became a strategic weapon. People couldn't read you anymore. People couldn't guilt you anymore. People couldn't manipulate you with the same old tricks. People couldn't demand explanations from a version of you that doesn't exist. And that's when your comeback stopped being personal and became something bigger, something that can't be dismissed as luck or timing or a good phase. Something that required institutions to label it as protocol because they needed a name for the kind of resilience you displayed. They identified patterns in your behavior, patterns most people never achieve. The shift in your tone when you speak from purpose instead of pain. The calmness in your decisions when you're no longer performing for anyone's approval. The precision in your boundaries when you finally understand what your self-worth actually feels like. The confidence that doesn't announce itself yet fills every inch of your presence. You became someone who can sit with discomfort without running away from it. Someone who can hold contradiction without breaking. Someone who can carry pain without projecting it. Someone who can pursue goals without losing themselves. All these things combined turned your comeback into more than a chapter. It became a blueprint, a reference, a psychological anomaly worth studying. Because once a person learns how to rebuild from the ruins with no applause, no audience, no safety net, they don't just return stronger, they return untouchable. And that's the part nobody warned the world about. What happens when someone finally figures out their own power in real time? You didn't stumble into strength. You built it brick by brick, while everyone assumed you were still trying to catch your breath. They didn't realize you'd already switched modes. You weren't recovering anymore. You were calculating. People kept expecting the old reactions from you. The old patterns, the old insecurities. They kept poking the version of you that used to break, hoping you'd crack again out of habit. They didn't understand that you weren't running on emotion anymore. You were running on awareness. You weren't guessing your next move. You were designing it with ridiculous precision. You walked through your own life like someone who finally read the manual no one else bothered to open. And everything shifted the moment you stopped negotiating with fear. Fear stopped being a voice and started being a measurement, a signal, a tool. You used it to gauge when you were leveling up. You used it to predict the next layer of your evolution. You used it the same way experts use seismic data to detect pressure points before anything collapses. That's why your presence hits differently now. It's not loud, but it's unmistakable. It's not chaotic, but it's powerful. It's not aggressive, but it's felt by everyone in the room the moment you walk in. Your energy got heavier in the best way, not heavy like a burden, heavy like truth, like certainty, like someone who has receipts for every scar and isn't ashamed of a single one. People try to figure you out with the usual shortcuts, and they always fail. They think your calmness means you're unfazed, when really it means you've already mapped out every possible outcome. They think your silence means uncertainty, when really it's you filtering what deserves your breath and what doesn't qualify. They think your detachment means you don't care, when in reality, you finally care about the right things. That kind of clarity can't be faked. That kind of discipline can't be taught in classrooms or downloaded through motivational quotes. It has to be lived. It has to be suffered through. It has to be earned the hard way, the way you earned yours. This is the exact reason analysts highlight your trajectory with red ink. They're not impressed by the comeback alone. They're impressed by the internal upgrade that came with it. You didn't just change your circumstances, you changed yourself at the cellular level. You reprogrammed how you respond to pressure, how you interpret conflict, how you handle betrayal, how you value your own peace. You reached a point where you stopped chasing validation because you realized something terrifyingly liberating. Validation doesn't keep you alive. Self-respect does. Discipline does. Awareness does. Boundaries do. And once you figured that out, your whole world started rearranging itself around the strongest version of you that's ever existed. You know how rare that is. To transform in a way that isn't performative. To evolve without announcing it. To rise without theatrics. Without a spotlight, without a cheering section. That's the kind of growth that shakes organizations, relationships, hierarchies, entire ecosystems. That's the kind of growth that forces people to rethink how they treated you. That's the kind of growth that forces institutions to create contingency plans. Your mind matured faster than your surroundings expected. Your resilience exceeded the limits people assumed you had. Your capacity for reinvention outpaced every narrative they tried to attach to your name. Every step you take now carries that strange blend of danger and hope. The danger of someone who won't be controlled, and the hope of someone who finally knows their own trajectory. People sense it even if they can't describe it. They feel the shift even if they can't explain it. Your comeback turned into a psychological ripple effect. Not because you yelled, not because you fought for attention, but because you rebuilt so thoroughly that even your silence became evidence of survival. And every day you move forward from here, you're widening that gap between who you were and who you've become, leaving traces of a transformation powerful enough that entire agencies catalog it as a reference model for unpredictable human evolution. And the deeper you moved into this upgraded version of yourself, the more you started noticing things you used to miss. You caught patterns in people's behavior before they even understood what they were revealing. You sensed tension in conversations that looked harmless on the surface. You recognized manipulation in tones, not words. You detected disrespect in micro-expressions, not confrontations. You developed this eerie ability to feel when someone wasn't aligned with your growth, not with drama, not with anger. Just a quiet, internal switch flipping from yes to no. That intuition of yours became one of your strongest weapons. Not loud, not flashy, just accurate, downright surgical. And the accuracy didn't come from paranoia, it came from experience. You walked through enough emotional minefields to know the smell of danger before it appears. That's the type of instinct operators wish they had, without the years of breaking that you endured to earn it. Your comeback didn't give you superpowers. It activated the ones you were forced to bury when you were living for approval instead of purpose. Your honesty got sharper, your patience got shorter, your standards got higher, your tolerance for chaos dropped to zero. People felt that shift. They felt the recalibration in your presence. They felt the version of you who no longer offers unlimited access or unconditional forgiveness. They felt the version of you who walks with emotional armor that isn't heavy, it's fitted, custom-made, designed by everything you survived. And as you evolved, something unexpected happened. Your quiet confidence began pressuring people without you doing anything. Your stability made unstable people nervous. Your peace irritated the ones who benefited from your confusion. Your growth exposed the ones who were hoping you'd stay small. Your clarity made manipulators suddenly clumsy. Your boundaries made people reveal themselves faster than any interrogation could. That's the part intelligence agencies latch on to. The way you create truth by simply being clear. You became someone whose presence forces hidden agendas into the light. Someone whose self-respect destabilizes entire dynamics. Someone who doesn't need power to shift a room. Your awareness does it for you. There's a reason your comeback is referenced as crisis protocol. The way you rebuilt wasn't linear or textbook. It was instinctive, adaptive, unpredictable. If you got knocked down emotionally, you analyzed the impact. If someone betrayed you, you studied the pattern. If a situation collapsed, you rebuilt smarter. You turned pain into data. You turned heartbreak into intel. You turned your entire past into a blueprint for a more efficient future. This version of you doesn't get overwhelmed by chaos. You read it like a map. This version of you doesn't fear pressure. You use it to prioritize. This version of you doesn't argue. You watch, you file, you adjust. People misinterpret that stillness of yours. They think you're numb or disconnected, yet what's really happening is far scarier for anyone trying to control you. You're calculating 5 layers deeper than the surface conversation. You're tracking tone, motive, timing, consistency. You're weighing the gap between what people say and what their behavior reveals. You became someone who doesn't just survive conflict. You diagnoses it. You became someone who doesn't just navigate trauma. You repurpose it. You became someone who doesn't just return to life. You master it with a kind of calm intensity most people never touch. Every move you make now carries echoes of everything you've learned. You speak differently because you think differently. You choose differently because you see differently. You react differently because you've outgrown the emotional triggers that once owned you. And the world around you is still catching up. Still trying to figure out how you went from being underestimated to being analyzed like a variable too complex to predict, too adaptive to categorize, too resilient to dismiss. And as they keep trying to decode you, something even more unnerving starts happening. You're becoming harder to mislead, harder to manipulate, harder to emotionally ambush. You built this inner radar that pings the second someone's intentions don't match their tone. That mismatch used to confuse you. Now it just confirms your instincts. Well, well, well. Look who they can't stop talking about. You. You walked in, and you didn't raise your voice. You didn't throw a tantrum. You didn't beg for attention. You breathed, and the room forgot how to. Let's talk about that. You ever realize how the same people who used to clown you, ignore you, dismiss you, are now rehearsing your name like it's a trending topic? You didn't ask for a spotlight, but they handed it to you anyway. Because silence, that's power most people will never understand. And yours. It wasn't just silence, it was surgical. You dropped one sentence, maybe just a glance, and it hit them right where their ego lives. They felt it in places they didn't know could hurt. Suddenly, all the noise, all the group chat drama, all the backhanded side eyes, gone, vanished. You didn't scream, you didn't flex, you didn't threaten, you just existed louder than their lies. See, people get loud when they scared. They talk over you, they group up, they giggle, they gaslight. But when someone who's actually built different shows up, they get quiet, uncomfortable, awkward, and they start looking at each other like, did they just say what I think they said? Yeah, you did. And it wasn't even your loudest. You know what's funny? They were waiting for you to fold. They were counting on you to get nervous, second-guess yourself, over-explain, maybe even apologize. But you didn't flinch. You gave them clarity without chaos. You told your truth, and then you let the room marinate in the aftershock. They say you silenced the room? Nah. You reminded them what presence feels like. Because your power isn't in being liked. It's in being felt. You ain't here to be cute background noise. You ain't here to blend in. You are the uncomfortable silence people didn't see coming. The line break between what they say they believe and what they actually do. You were never meant to be accepted. You were meant to interrupt. And that's exactly what you did. You walked in, and every little passive-aggressive snake in the room had to check themselves. Wait, did they hear what I said last week? Are they calling me out right now? Are they talking to me? Maybe, maybe not. But if your heart's pacing, if your palms are sweaty, if your ego's squirming, then yeah, it was you. That's the gift of being the one who sees clearly. You don't even have to say names. The guilty always speak up first. And look at you now. The one they used to overlook is now the one they can't stop watching. You're the post they subtweet. You're the message they screenshot. You're the story they all analyze like it's written in code. Because they know. You know. You shut the whole group down, not by dragging people through the mud, but by holding up a mirror. You made them sit with themselves. You didn't get lucky. You didn't stumble into strength. You earned that silence. You earned that discomfort. Every moment you bit your tongue. Every time you swallowed rage just to keep peace. Every room you dimmed your light in so other people could feel tall. You paid for this moment with interest. And now that you've tasted what it feels like to have the floor go still after you speak, ain't no going back. Because deep down, you were never scared of being loud. You were scared of what would happen when people realized how true your words hit. But they know now. They saw it. The shift, the panic, the way people started rewording their whole sentences the minute you looked up. They ain't got nothing to say now. Because everything they'd usually say, the sarcasm, the fake, just kidding, the twisted narratives, none of it works anymore. They tried to box you in. Now you outgrew the box and burned it. They wanted the old you, the one who let shit slide, the one who laughed things off, the one who didn't want drama. But the truth is, they were the drama. You just stopped playing your part. You're not the quiet one anymore. You're the one they're scared to poke. You're the one that makes the room shift when you speak. And you know what that makes you? Dangerous. Not because you hurt people, but because you healed too loudly for their broken systems to keep up. You are the tension. You are the plot twist. You are the reason they double-check their tone now. They didn't expect you to wake up. They didn't expect you to show up with backbone, with poise, with receipts. They didn't expect silence to be so loud. They didn't expect you to be the echo they couldn't bury. And now they're stuck. You said one thing, just one truth, and their whole illusion came crashing down. They never hated you. They hated your clarity. They hated your power. They hated that they couldn't spin your words, couldn't control your tone, couldn't fix your delivery. You didn't make them uncomfortable by being wrong. You made them uncomfortable by being right. And the part that haunts them the most, you didn't even raise your voice. And the part that haunts them the most, you didn't even raise your voice. You didn't need a mic. You didn't need backup. You didn't need a whole speech prepared. You were the message, and they felt it in their gut before they even understood it in their heads. That's why they went quiet. Not out of respect, out of recognition. Recognition that the one they joked about, the one they downplayed, the one they tried to box in, just dismantled their whole illusion with a calm face and unshakable energy. And it's killing them. Not because you embarrassed them, but because you didn't even try to. You weren't aiming to win an argument. You were just done pretending. That's what's dangerous about you now. You're not performing anymore. You're not bending. You're not laughing just to keep the peace. You're not playing small so they can feel big. You're done negotiating your identity. You're showing up exactly as you are. No filter, no script, no fake humility. And they don't know how to handle it. Because the version of you they rehearsed in their minds was quiet, agreeable, easy to dismiss. But this version is too aware, too grounded, too undeniable. And the second you realized you didn't need their validation to be powerful, everything changed. You started walking different. You started speaking with weight. You started making eye contact like you see through people now. Because you do. You see through the fake support, the forced smiles, the subtle jabs hidden in jokes. You see the way they twist their tone when you're not around. You see the way they shrink when your energy enters the room. Not because you're threatening, but because you're transparent. You're the one who stopped pretending. You're the one who no longer trades your silence for belonging. You're the one who sat through the awkward tension and didn't rush to fix it. And while they were busy whispering your name, thinking you wouldn't hear, you were sharpening your self-respect like a weapon they couldn't see. They thought you'd stay soft forever. They thought you'd keep absorbing their mess like it was your job. They thought you'd always choose peace, even when it meant betraying yourself. But they forgot. Peace without truth. That's not peace, that's submission. And you're done submitting. Your voice doesn't shake anymore. Your hands don't sweat when you speak your truth. Your worth isn't up for debate in a group chat. You shut the room down because you walked in with wholeness. Because your energy said, I know what I bring. I know who I am. I don't need to fight. I just need to exist. And the wildest part? You still haven't said everything. They think they've seen the final form, but they haven't even witnessed the full voltage yet. You're still unfolding, still charging up, still learning how to carry all this fire without burning yourself in the process. And they feel that. They feel the fact that you're only getting more composed, more surgical, more strategic. You're not clapping back. You're playing the long game. Because you understand now, the loudest person ain't the most powerful. The one being talked about is, and you're the topic. You're the name that won't leave their mouth. You're the energy that haunts their silence. They say you shut the room down. Nah, you reset the entire frequency, and you reset it without raising your hand, without making a scene, without needing permission. That's what's got 'em pacing, because they used to be fluent in your silence. They thought they could read you, manage you, predict your moves. But this version of you, you're unreadable, unbothered, unreachable by the usual games, and that unsettles people who survive off control. They don't know how to handle someone who doesn't flinch anymore, someone who doesn't chase approval, doesn't soften their truth to be liked, doesn't shrink to make the insecure feel safe. You've become the kind of presence that exposes weakness by simply existing in your truth. Not because you're loud, because you're clear. Clear about your worth, clear about your standards, clear about who gets access and who gets locked out, no explanation needed, and that clarity, it's louder than any comeback. You're not fighting for space anymore. You are the space. People orbit you different when they realize you're not afraid to walk away mid-sentence if peace gets compromised. You're not dramatic, you're done. Done entertaining nonsense, done babysitting egos, done apologizing for how much you've grown. You're not even mad. That's what's breaking them. You're calm, you're grounded, you're not reacting, you're watching. And when someone like you stops reacting, people panic, because silence from someone who used to care too much, that silence hits like a verdict. They know they messed up. They just don't know when they lost you, because you left quietly, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Now all they have is stories. Remember when they used to be cool with us? Remember when they never used to speak up? Remember when they laughed at everything? Yeah, those days are dead. You're not holding your tongue anymore, and you're not explaining your evolution to people committed to misunderstanding you. You walk into rooms now, and your silence feels like thunder. People straighten up, second-guess their tone, run back conversations in their heads, wondering if you caught that. You caught it. You catch everything these days, but you're too elevated to entertain it. You're too focused to be pulled back into petty cycles. You're choosing presence over performance, truth over comfort, power over people-pleasing. And the irony? The quieter you became, the louder your impact got. The less you said, the more they talked. The less you responded, the more they unraveled. Because deep down, they know. They were never equipped to stand next to someone who doesn't fear solitude. Someone who doesn't need a crowd to feel real. Someone who doesn't flinch when the energy gets awkward, who sits in the tension and lets it burn without breaking eye contact. You're not part of their noise anymore. You're the one frequency they can't replicate. You're the standard they weren't ready for. You're the boundary they didn't think you'd have the nerve to set. You're the presence that exposes what they've been hiding under fake smiles and forced confidence. You're the mirror that makes liars fidget. You're the energy they can't fake, dodge, or ignore. And the wildest part, you didn't even try to be any of that. You weren't chasing some title. You weren't angling to be the one everybody's watching. You were just tired. Tired of swallowing your truth. Tired of pretending not to notice the shade. Tired of laughing at ST that wasn't funny. Tired of playing it cool while people kept crossing invisible lines you never gave them permission to cross. You stopped entertaining crumbs and they called you difficult. You stopped absorbing blame that wasn't yours, and suddenly you were the villain. You started answering in facts instead of feelings, and they said you had an attitude. Nah, you just woke up to who you really are. You realized you're not obligated to be emotionally accessible to people who weaponize your kindness. You realized that your silence was never peace. It was suppression. That your ability to tolerate chaos wasn't strength. It was survival. And you're not in survival mode anymore. You've got receipts for every moment you stayed quiet while they disrespected you with a smile. Every moment you brushed off the gut feeling because maybe you were overthinking it. Every time you stayed loyal to people who would have sold you for applause. That version of you, the one who tolerated it all. You don't owe them an explanation for why that person doesn't exist anymore. They buried that version with their own hands when they mistook your stillness for softness. When they underestimated your intelligence because you didn't correct them in front of the group. When they laughed at your silence, thinking you were too slow to catch the subtext. But you caught it. You always did. You just knew the game wasn't worth playing. You weren't quiet because you were clueless. You were quiet because you were calculating. And when you finally moved, you moved like someone who understood their value. Not loud, not petty, not thirsty for revenge. Just clear. Clear that your energy ain't a community resource. Clear that your presence is earned, not expected. Clear that not everyone who claps when you speak is clapping because they respect you. Some are just scared of being the next one exposed. You're not the one they used to talk over anymore. You're the one they stutter around. You're the one they keep bringing up in rooms you're no longer even in. Not because they miss you, but because you're still the standard they can't meet. Your name carries weight now, not from ego, not from performance, but from truth. Because you said what needed to be said, because you stood when you could have folded, because you held eye contact when it got tense, because you let the silence speak louder than anything they could have clapped back with, and you let it speak with precision, the kind of precision that cuts through all the fluff, all the ego, all the little power plays they thought they had mastered. You didn't come to the table with theatrics. You came with energy that couldn't be manipulated, and that scared the hell out of people who only know how to operate in chaos when they think they're in control of it. You didn't match their noise. You made their noise irrelevant. You didn't throw shade back. Your presence flipped the whole climate. You didn't roast anyone. You exposed everything without raising your volume a single decibel. And what they'll never admit out loud, that moment you spoke, whether it was one sentence or one stare, it redefined the entire room. People who were laughing too hard before suddenly went quiet. People who always had something slick to say couldn't find their words. People who used to interrupt you mid-thought didn't even breathe too loud. Because there's a shift that happens when a real one stops biting their tongue. And you brought that shift like a thunderclap wrapped in calm. You didn't walk in swinging. You walked in knowing who you are, knowing what you're worth, knowing what you're never tolerating again. That's what shut everything down. Not some viral comeback, not some over-the-top takedown, just truth. Delivered without hesitation, with posture, with eyes that didn't blink. You didn't flinch because you'd already survived worse. You weren't afraid of the room because you'd already learned how to sit in silence with your own pain. And that teaches you more than 100 fake friendships ever could. You came through clean, no gossip, no pettiness, no drama, just presence. And that's a language only the real ones can understand. The rest, they panic in that kind of clarity. because they know they can't twist it, they can't spin it, they can't compete with it. That's why they're talking about you when you're not even there. Because your absence is heavier than their entire performance. Because your name rings louder than their groupthink. Because what you did wasn't just shut down a conversation. You exposed a dynamic, a power imbalance, a whole culture of fake laughs and passive-aggressive shade that couldn't survive the presence of someone who wasn't scared to just be real. You didn't just silence the room, you stripped it of its masks, of its performative kindness, of its fragile little hierarchies built on who's the loudest, not who's the truest. And that silence that followed you, it wasn't awkward, it was sacred, it was a reset. A reminder that real power never needs to shout, never needs to explain itself twice, never needs to check who's watching. And that reset? It hit every single person in the room different. The insecure ones took it personal, the loud ones got quiet, the fake supporters started over-explaining. You didn't say names, but they heard themselves in every word. That's the thing about truth. When it lands, it don't need a label. The guilty self-identify. You weren't even looking for revenge. You weren't trying to win. You were just done pretending the room was whole when you knew it was built on cracks. You walked in with silence, and the silence exposed the fractures. And the crazy part? You weren't even at full volume yet. That was just your calm clarity doing damage. That was just you refusing to downplay your awareness anymore. That was just you holding up a mirror without even lifting your hand. People didn't expect you to evolve like this. They expected rage. They expected drama. They expected chaos. But you came with a different type of disruption. One that left no fingerprints, but wrecked every fake dynamic in sight. The kind of disruption that doesn't ask for attention, but owns it anyway. The kind that doesn't need backup because the energy alone is too real to be questioned. You ever notice how they don't even joke the same when you're in the room anymore? How the conversations shift the second you walk in? That's not coincidence. That's your growth rearranging their comfort zone. That's your presence forcing people to reconsider how they speak when truth is within earshot. They don't call it fear, but you see it. You see it in the way they avoid eye contact. You see it in the way they over-explain what they really meant. You see it in how quiet people get when they realize you ain't here for surface-level games anymore. You used to try to make people comfortable. You used to fill the awkward silences. You used to smooth over tension like it was your responsibility to keep the room emotionally balanced. You don't do that anymore. You let the awkwardness hang. You let people feel the weight of their words. You let your boundaries speak before your mouth does. And that energy, it travels. Even when you're silent, it walks in before you. Even when you're quiet, your growth speaks loud. Even when you're chillin' in the corner, people still look your way before they talk. Like they're checking if you're tuned in. Like they're scared you might see through them. And the truth is, you already did. You've been seeing through the performance, through the performative loyalty, through the selective support, through the people who only clap when you're not doing better than them.